You all right? So I heard Joel pulled you into something crazy. Was it? Yeah. I have no idea who that person is. Good morning, Glories. I am so grateful to introduce Owen. Owen is a member with his wife and chillins in the church, and he's the first park ranger that I've had in a congregation. How are you? I didn't see you there. Nice to see you. So when I first approached him about this, I thought he was just going to do a thing on the national parks. Calvin calls nature the theater of God's glory. And I thought we were going to talk about why you should go to the parks and just be in awe at what God has done in them, right? Love that. And then he told me he was going to do organized religion in the national parks, which actually is a great topic. And when I was in seminary, a number of my friends for summer worked in Yellowstone, and they did beaver work during the week, cleaning bathrooms and all that. But on the weekends, they put on worship services for campers. And of course, that's issued into a lawsuit now that Owen will tell us about. But I am so grateful for your work and for all you've done here. So welcome. Thank you.
So I've been a national park ranger for about the last 15 years. I'll go into a little bit more depth on my backstory in a minute. We'll do a little icebreaker. I mean, I'll ask questions and y'all can just shout out answers as you know them. Kathleen doesn't think anyone will know what this national park is. Do we have any guesses? Ah, there. See, I told you somebody would know. Yes. So we have, am I up on the right? Oh, what did I screw up? It's just slow. Okay. Okay. No, you're good. All right. This was an easy one anyway. All right. We got arches. All right. Let me see my delay. Oh, it's just a little delay. Okay. All right. Do anybody know this one? Grand Tetons up there in Wyoming, just south of Yellowstone. Slightly more difficult. Crater Lake, yes. Up in Oregon. And a little bit more difficult. I think it's the last one. Highest population of black bears in a condensed area, or brown bears in a condensed area. Katmai National Park in Alaska. There's so many salmon there. The bears don't actually fight each other. It's just kind of an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's kind of an interesting ecological spot. So I want to talk a little bit about today about who I am. I explain that, why I know a little bit about this, and then what I mean by national parks. Then just kind of give you some food for thought of if you think, Guy, what do you got? So I've been about 2/3 of the parks, and then over what? Oh, the ones I just showed. I think I've been to all of those. Yes, I've been to all those. And then over half of our national park sites that I'll go into here in a little bit. And then we'll talk a little, to make it fun, controversy is always fun. We'll talk about some controversy that's happened with religious services in the parks, actual religious structures and churches that are built inside the parks, and some religious symbols. And hopefully we'll have time. I'll give you some tips and tricks I've learned about good ways to visit the parks, because they are getting more and more crowded. And especially if you go in the summertime, employees like myself kind of have a joke saying of, you get to do a tour of America's most crowded parking lots. So I can give you some tips to hopefully avoid that. So I grew up in Louisiana. I got lucky. My family had a little camper that we travel around in the summer with. By the time I graduated high school, I'd been to all 48 continental states. I've now done all 50 and about a couple different territories as well. Had a lot of fun moving around. In high school, I started realizing I could work in public lands. This little Civil War battle near my house in Louisiana, I got to occasionally portray the world's history's tallest Civil War soldier. Literally, I went barefoot most of the time because they didn't have shoes that fit me. I was like, it's accurate for most of the South, at least. After college, I went to DC. I joke I kind of did the top-down career approach. I started in the head office at Interior Department, worked for the director of the National Park Service, and then I got out in the field. And many of y'all have probably spent your lives working behind a desk. I will say, working behind a desk for the National Park Service, especially in main interior, when you have to go down the main hall and there's like 20-foot by 10-foot paintings of all the national park landscapes, is just morally devastating. So I was very glad to get out from behind a desk. One of my first field jobs was a river ranger. Does anybody have a guess at this park? It is in West Virginia. It is New River. Used to be a national river. It became a national park just a few years ago. That's New River. Whoop. I have not. I've been there when people have jumped off. Sometimes resulting in some injury. It's an interesting. It's one of the few National Park Service generally bans base jumping and parachuting in all our park sites, but one weekend a year they allow it off of that bridge through a permit, and it actually becomes like the highest populated area in West Virginia during that weekend. So from there, I went out to Colorado. We have the National Park Service has a national recreation area right next to Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. I'll be shocked if anybody knows what this one is, but it's this is Curricani National Recreation Area, a couple lakes on the river that feeds into the Black Canyon. If anybody's owned a boat, there's the good joke of only thing better than owning a boat is having a friend that owns a boat, because you don't have to pay for the upkeep and the fuel and everything. The only thing better than that is having the government own a boat, because then you really don't have to pay for anything. This is where Curricani is. It was a fun little spot to work for a few months. From there, went to Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San Francisco. Kathleen and I were there for 4 years, six years. It was a blur. Had a lot of fun. Pre-kids, got a little bit bigger boat. Had a bunch of coastline to patrol, and then about 9 years ago we moved back here, and now I'm over on the Natchez Trace Parkway that starts over by the Loveless Cafe. It's one of the more scenic shots of it. Many of you know the bridge we have in Williamson County. That's part of the parkway. It's an old historic trading route that starts up here. Pointer in Nashville, and then cuts a little corner of Alabama and goes all the way down to Natchez, Mississippi. So that's where we're at now. So when we talk about the national parks, but I don't always mean just the ones that have the word park at the end. There's 63 of those, and Congress makes something a national park. They actually have to pass something, which with a couple hundred of them is not always the easiest. The president makes something a national monument. So a lot of times, like New River, you see something became a national park. But if you look, it was already a National Park Service site. It already had park rangers and junior ranger books and the whole 9 yards. All that happens is Congress passes something to make it a park, and they have to reprint all their brochures and change all the signs and change the word. That's pretty much it. So there are 428 of these national park sites around the country. Most of them are national parks and monuments, and then there's a few of these other little random sites scattered throughout. So this is what most people think when they think the parks. This is the 63 that we have right now, kind of scattered around and then down, including the Virgin Islands, Alaska. And the furthest one, anybody see what the furthest one outlier national park would be? American Samoa is going to be the furthest, way out near Japan almost. And it's actually a leased because the tribes own the land. The government's prohibited. So let's see if I can get... This is a map that shows, give you an idea of, the first was just the 63 national parks. This is all 428 national park sites. If you see all the little tiny black letters, little tiny green specks all throughout, this shows, and some of them we can't even fit on the map. National, it's all just listed down here on the side. But every little black spot is a National Park Service site. To give you an idea, kind of zooming in just around Nashville, these are all the sites just around Nashville that are run by the National Park Service. In a lot of ways has the best of the best, but broadening out just public land in general, 28% of the country is actually federal public land. So we have a large amount, over a quarter of the country is owned by the federal government. So that kind of opened itself up for a lot of kind of conflict and controversy with that amount of land. But surely there's no controversy or conflict in the national parks. Like this is, if you've seen the Ken Burns documentary, it's really good. It's on HBO right now if you want to watch it. America's Best Idea is one of the good taglines. People also call the national parks America's Crown Jewels or America's Classroom. So surely everybody gets along. There's no arguing. They're wonderful sites. If there was, I wouldn't have to do any law enforcement. I could just do search and rescue. Life would be wonderful. But no, unfortunately, the national parks, even just in the mission statement of the National Park Service, there's conflict. This is the mission statement of the Park Service. So the Park Service is supposed to preserve the sites it has unimpaired for the enjoyment of this generation and future generations. So your grandchildren's grandchildren are supposed to be able to enjoy the park the same way you are. So how does the Park Service keep something safe and from being damaged, but also let people enjoy it at the same time? So it's kind of the juxtaposition that happens. And when we talk about religion, the parks have to balance that with the First Amendment. And I'll preface this with, I am not a lawyer. Most of my law stuff is Fourth Amendment, being law enforcement with search and seizure, but we do unfortunately have to deal with a fair amount of First Amendment. So this is the main separation of church and state clause coming out of the First Amendment. And it's kind of broken into two parts. These are the two different clauses. I just gave it away. I was going to make any attorneys guess the names of the two clauses. So we have the Establishment Clause. It's the Lemon Test by one of the Supreme Court cases. 3 different elements. The government can only assist religion if these 3 criteria are met. And then the Free Exercise Clause is protecting citizens' rights to practice their religion. But where the government has to balance it, especially in the national parks, is it can't run afoul of public morals or compelling government interest. And the compelling government interest is what we'll get into in a little bit. So this First Amendment was ratified 1791. 1916, the National Park Service gets founded. So national parks start getting created all around the country. So then we have to decide, what role does religion play in these new public lands that are being created in some of the most scenic places in the country. And does anybody know these 2 gentlemen? John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. Does anybody have any idea what they have in common on the religious side? Both Presbyterians. John Muir grew up, his father was a hardliner Presbyterian. Read your Bible, go to bed by 8 p.m. That's all you have to do. He got a little dissuaded by that and wound up finding more religion in nature, but kind of grew up Presbyterian. And this is when they were discussing setting Yosemite aside as some of the first public land. Another national park, Haleakala National Park. So we have this beautiful scenic national park in Hawaii. So National Park Service has to decide, what role does religion play here? And so Haleakala, even the name itself means house of the sun. So there's a little caveat of, if the government's deciding what role does religion play in these new public lands, religion actually existed in these public lands long before the government got them. So Haleakala itself is a native Hawaiian word that means house of the sun. And this is a site where some of the native Hawaiians would go up, and they believed that the sun god La traveled across the sky, and the demigod Maui went up to the top of this mountain, lassoed La, held him captive, forced him until he agreed to slow down his path across the sky, and then Maui released La. And so a lot of the native Hawaiians actually still come to this mountain to practice their religion. One of the big things that the indigenous people really dislike is when people come to the national parks and they act like all the indigenous culture is long in the past, but a lot of these tribes still exist today. So the government has to balance this, and they actually let these tribes come up and not pay an entrance fee if they're going up to the mountain for a sunrise ceremony or to worship. It would be like if the government tried to make us pay to come to Westminster, we wouldn't take it that well. So it's kind of one of the many balancing acts that happens in the parks. Another one, Devil's Tower. A lot of these places have such scenic beauty that native tribes have religious beliefs that go along with them. The Crow tribe believes that this site is where 2 girls were camping, and the Great Spirit saw a bear about to attack them. So the Great Spirit started to rise the land around them. The bear started clawing the land as it was risen, and that's where these giant kind of claw-looking marks on the side of the mountain appeared. So these tribes still find this a very sacred site to them. And so if you put yourself kind of in the shoes of park superintendents or the individuals that run each individual park site. So if you're the superintendent of this site, you have ancient religious history of the indigenous people that are still practicing that religion today. And June that we're in right now is actually a very sacred month for them. A lot of the tribes travel to Devil's Tower to worship during the month of June, but Devil's Tower is also a very popular rock climbing spot. So if you have tribes trying to worship and you have people trying to, rock climb shirtless across this thing, how do you balance that as a park manager by letting the tribes exercise their First Amendment right in worship, but also, following the mission statement of the National Park Service, letting people enjoy this. At this site, so think in your head kind of what you would do in that. What the government wound up doing is the superintendent asked people to voluntarily not rock climb during the month of June. And just that request actually caused a lawsuit. Some of the rock climbers did sue, saying that that was a violation of the First Amendment, of the specifically the endorsement establishment clause of the First Amendment, and that the government was endorsing religion by asking them not to climb during that month. And the courts dismissed that lawsuit, saying the rock climbers didn't actually have any standing because they couldn't show they were actually being harmed. So the courts didn't actually make a ruling specifically on whether or not that was a violation of the establishment clause. And that's a few things we'll see in a couple of the other lawsuits, that lawsuits happen, rulings come out, and they don't actually wind up answering the questions at the heart of it. So Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, indigenous cliff dwellings happen there. Religion was happening there long before this became, before even any white settlers came over into the Americas. This is a look at one of the kivas and kind of looking at some of the creation stories of the indigenous people matching ours. The indigenous people, a lot of them, the emergent stories from them, where the religions began, where they came onto the earth, coming from inside the earth. Mesa Verde and a lot of the Southwest sites, you'll see these kivas, and a lot of them have these little symbolic holes in the ground. This kind of symbolizes to them, as they're in there worshiping, the hole from the earth that they came out of. So as Christians, we have the Garden as our origin story. This is a lot of the similarity across the Southwest. Wind Cave National Park up in South Dakota is a little different. There, the National Park Service has Wind Cave, which is a giant cave structure or system inside the earth. This is one of the original entrances, and this is the entrance down there where the native Lakota tribe believes that their people actually did emerge from the earth. So that's a balancing act of extremely sacred site where they believe it would be like the government taking over the Garden of Eden. So very, very, yes. They still allow them. Just try, there's different cave entrances. So try to use those, and then try to maintain a real good relationship with the tribe, and have a lot of literature and education ahead of time of showing reverence to the site as people are using it. So bringing it across, we've talked a lot about the indigenous history and their religious beliefs, but those aren't alone in some of the parks. This is, everybody know this park? Grand Canyon. We have Grand Canyon National Park. It's a good quote I like that kind of sums up how a lot of Christians view this site when they come see it for the first time or fifth or sixth. It's pretty hard not to be moved by the Grand Canyon. But Grand Canyon means different things to a lot of different people, including Christians. Christians are not a monolith, and there are a lot of Christians that believe the Grand Canyon is actually proof of creationism or proof of the Great Flood. They believe that only the amount of water in the Great Flood could have caused this and wasn't created over a couple 100 million years. So if you are the superintendent of Grand Canyon National Park and Christian groups come to you and they want to put a book in the bookstore, bearing in mind you have books in the bookstore about the native indigenous culture of the area, their religious beliefs, and Christian groups come to you, this book's called Grand Canyon, A Different View. And it's 26 different creationists that have put together their viewpoints on how the Grand Canyon was created, either instantly by God or through the Great Flood of Noah. So if you think to yourself, if you were the superintendent, the mission statement of the national parks, First Amendment, do you allow this book in the bookstore or not? Right now, the government does allow this book in the bookstore. And then also there's another lawsuit. The government just wound up they got sued at the Grand Canyon. A creationist came and wanted to collect rocks, but the government held that that wasn't enough scientific purpose. So they prohibited him from collecting rocks under one of the public laws. The government got sued and the government reversed its course and now has let them collect rocks. So things like that are popping up all the time in the national parks of what's allowed, what's not, what's appropriate. So then we'll go into kind of some specific examples, kind of make it fun, because controversy is always fun. As pretty as these places are, there's a lot of balancing acts. So looking at these national park sites, some things to consider is, should the National Park Service allow actual religious services to be held in these parks? It's very hard to go to some of these very scenic places and not get moved spiritually or religiously, but actual organized services. If you were managing one of these parks, would you allow services to occur inside the parks? Or would you allow religious buildings to exist inside the park boundaries, or religious symbols like crosses, plaques with psalms on them, things like that? So another law, in addition to the First Amendment, in 1993, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed. And this is what the government, specifically the National Park Service, often has to balance when they're trying to make some of these decisions. So the important parts of this are the government can't burden somebody's exercise of religion unless the burden further, unless whatever burden we place on the people, like making them move the service to a certain location in the park, we have to have a compelling government interest to do that. And we have to do it by the government has to do it by the least restrictive means possible. So examples of that is, does anybody know where this is? Alcatraz. Somebody beats you to it. So what does Alcatraz have to do with religious services? There were Christian services on the island. We'll get to that in a little bit, but I spent about a year and a half out there on the island, had a great time. But twice a year, this island actually holds a lot of importance to the indigenous people. So back to the indigenous people, they did it first. So before this was a federal prison, it actually held some of the, let's see, I'm trying to remember my tribe, the Hopi. There were a couple, I think 9 or 12 Hopi prisoners that were held on the island because they refused to Americanize. And then after the island shut down as a federal prison, in the 1960s, there was an old treaty from 100 years ago that said any unused federal land would go back to the tribes. And so some of the tribes looked out, saw this unused island. They took boats out there and kind of occupied it for about a year and a half and did a big protest movement. So now twice a year, a bunch of the local tribes get together. They come out to the island before the sun comes up and they do sunrise ceremonies on the island. So what used to be called Columbus Day, now Indigenous People Day, and then Thanksgiving morning as well. So how does the government balance allowing them to exercise free speech, but also if you came out to visit the prison and there was a ceremony happening all across the prison grounds and you couldn't experience the site, that would be a compelling government interest not to allow it. So to allow this, all these, a couple hundred people come out before the normal visiting public come out on separate boats, and then they're out here on the parade ground overlooking the city. And then the ceremony is over before the normal visitors arrive. So it's kind of one of the balancing acts that can occur. And so government allows the indigenous culture to come out, practice their services. So let's talk about Christianity. Should Christianity be allowed to have organized services in the national parks? Anybody have a guess of what the most common Christian service in the national parks is? Weddings. I've heard my wedding betters win. This is a wedding at, anybody guess the national park? Not Grand Teton, it's a little higher north. Glacier National Park. So similar to the sunrise ceremony in Alcatraz, the government allows organized church services in the national parks like weddings, but this is kind of off to the side. If you showed up to the main visiting area, the main parking lot, and it was just full for a wedding, you'd be pretty disappointed, upset, especially if you weren't a Christian. So weddings like this are often held off to the side in specific areas that aren't going to interfere with the general visiting public. And when it's done, all the crosses, everything comes down. Other services are held kind of in some public spaces that are used for different purposes. Does anybody want to guess what the most common denomination practicing in the national parks is? That's our Catholics. The Catholics right now are kind of the most active with organized services and masses in the parks. This is one of the Catholic masses in Yellowstone. If you're Catholic and you go to Yellowstone, you actually have 3 different places in the summertime where you can get mass. That's where these little red arrows are. And the Catholic Church actually put together a real quick 2-minute video. If I can, let me see if I'm good enough to exit out. I'm calling in for help. All right, let me. That's why I'm here. This is the services they hold kind of out there in just public multi-use areas. We'll talk about specific church structures. Just think about what that church does. If you feel like this is appropriate holding services out here.
For 3 minutes, we have this wine to offer. Proof that the The park really gets you in touch with reality. We are sitting on the biggest volcano on Earth. Beauty. The park really gets you in touch with reality. We are sitting on the biggest volcano on Earth. The beauty, the majesty, I mean, just the sheer reality of nature here. And I think when we get in touch with reality, we get in touch with God. And when we get in touch with God, we in the world transform. You just ride around here and it's majestic, it's awesome, it's amazing that this country had the foresight to protect these areas and preserve these areas and make them available for the whole world. We are in the Yellowstone National Park. Evening.
They're very scenic.
So weird.
That's fine. We have the Catholic Church that's just providing mass in a lot of the national parks for visiting Catholics. And then this is another group. And again, I don't think that owner can get any group. I'm just kind of giving you the facts here. The Christian Ministry National Parks has been operating national parks as an organization for about 70 years. The first couple decades, they were extremely active. And Guy kind of touched on it a little bit. What they did is they would actually take people as Christians and place them in specific jobs in the parks. A lot of times they would get favorable hiring as park employees, or a lot of times as concessionaire employees. That's the people in the lodges, the hotels that are in the parks, washing dishes, turning beds, doing that kind of work. And so a group was operating, in the beginning, they were really placing government employees a lot of the times, and they outspoken. And then government hiring practices have now changed. There was a lawsuit that showed you can't give preferential hiring preference to somebody because they're Christian into a government job. So now a lot of the times in with the current makeup of this organization, they're placing people, right now it's about 200 a year out into the national parks in these concessionaire jobs. I had a video of them talking about their stuff, but we'll skip that. Actually, if it plays.
When someone gives to a Christian ministry in the national parks,
That's okay. All right. So then, does anybody, it kind of came to a head with this organization. A lawsuit happened back in, I think it was 1993. I'll get the date in a second. At this national park, does anybody have a guess on this one? This is a very hard one. I'll give you a hint. That's Mexico out there, actually. I'm standing in Texas, but that's Mexico. Big Bend. This is the Chisos Mountains in Big Bend National Park, which is way down there. I will say a lot of people do not like Big Bend National Park. If you want to go there and enjoy it, let me know. I'll give you some tips. People are usually expecting something when they go in. But that organization's really active in the 1950s through the 1990s, promoting Christianity in the parks. And then 1993, this happened. So that's not good. This wound up being a lawsuit, and a lot of guardrails got placed in separation of church and state about how religion is advertised and practiced in the national parks. National Park Service, now this is kind of one of the main taglines off the government website. So Park Service has a responsibility to protect resources and prevent conflict among visitors, but we also want people, the Park Service also wants people to be able to practice their First Amendment. So no more barging into hotel rooms. Sandwich boards are okay. Posted on designated bulletin boards is okay. Also, a step down from like organized religious services like mass, other protected First Amendment religious speech like Jehovah's Witnesses handing out pamphlets, the gentleman at White Bridge and Harding who has his strong feelings about the Pope. Anyone like that wants to go out in the national parks, kind of the way case law has been done in the national parks. We now have, the Park Service now has designated First Amendment areas. If a group of less than 25 people wants to go and protest or practice religious beliefs, size in the parks, there are designated areas they can go without a permit. More than 25 people do need a permit. And to give you an idea, like this is Smoky Mountain National Park. This kind of shows where all their designated First Amendment spots are. Even the Natchez Trace Parkway, if you go to the Big Bridge in Williamson County, if you want to feel really strongly about something and want to protest, you can go do it in our designated First Amendment spot. These two little parking stalls right there. If you want, if I tick you off and you want to come to my office in Leapers Fork, you can protest on the front sidewalk and the back sidewalk. So throughout the National Park Service, these little sites have been created. That hasn't solved everything. Actually, just in the last 2 months, there was another lawsuit. Petersburg National Battlefield, the Knights of the Columbus, wanted to come out, hold a Catholic mass like they'd done year after year after year. And the government tried to restrict them to the designated First Amendment sites. They put in a lawsuit, said, nope, we should be able to practice where we want to in the battlefield. The government wound up rolling over with the lawsuit and allowing them to continue their mass as they have. So even with the First Amendment sites, it's still constantly changing. So that's some of the services that are held in the parks. Let's look at actual structures, actual church structures in the national parks. So let's look at, think in your head, does a church actual building belong inside of a national park? So, yep. So it's kind of a trick question. Some of the parks actually exist because of church structures. So we want to look at the Spanish missions coming up from Mexico. National Park Service protects a lot of these sites. This is Salinas Pueblo mission. This was built in 1922. For context, the Mayflower had landed 2 years before this church was built. 1622. Not that old. All right. Yep. Mayflower landed in 1620. This church was built in 1622. San Antonio Missions National Historic Park, also a UNESCO World Heritage Site from the early 1700s. It became a national park site in 1978. Outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, this church ruin is from a church that was built in 1717. An original church was there in 1625. The native tribes revolted against the Catholics. There was a big fight, a lot of death, and then Catholics came back in and rebuilt this structure. But then a lot of the Civil War battlefields, as Americans were kind of trying to come to terms with what had just happened, tearing the country apart, see a lot of chapels and churches popping up on Civil War battlefields. National Park Service later gets those lands, takes those structures in as part of the historic battlefield. This is a Tolson Chapel in Antietam. This is Primitive Baptist Church. Anybody know where this one is? It is in the Smokies down at Cades Cove. There are 3 churches in Cades Cove. They got folded in when Great Smoky Mountains National Park was created. This is back on Alcatraz Island. There were guards and their families that lived on the island. This is the church that they would worship in. The inmates had their own church inside the cell house. So those are some that got kind of folded in as the parks were created. But let's go here. Who knows this one? Yosemite Valley. Kind of one of the crown jewels of the crown jewels. So John Muir, who we talked about earlier, was one of the first ones to go in, one of the first white people to come into the valley to see it, really spend a lot of time there, and he pushed the government to turn it into a park. This is how John Muir felt about religion and churches in the park. So with this description, if you're the superintendent of Yosemite and a Christian group comes to you and says, we want to build a chapel in the middle of Yosemite Valley, do you think it's appropriate? Do you think it's legal with the First Amendment? What would you do? So Galen Clark was the superintendent at the time. This was his response when he got that request in 1878. So this church was built. It is now the oldest church, the oldest structure in Yosemite Valley. It was one of the first. The other ones before it have now crumbled and fallen apart. So you can go visit this chapel. I highly recommend it. You can decide for yourself. Go inside if you think it adds to your religious faith. If you walk outside, compare the valley. This is kind of a side view looking out. If you walk out the front doors of the chapel. This is the inside of the chapel. So you can go, well, experience it, make your own determination. That's kind of a non-denominational space. If People can rent it for weddings. Various services are held there. It is on government property. Here's another church inside of a national park. Yeah. Tetons. This is the Chapel of Transfiguration. Anybody know the denomination that has this church? Episcopalians. I grew up Episcopalian. My diet Catholics, all of the religion, none of the guilt. They have the Chapel of the Transfiguration, Grand Tetons, right there. So I thought I had it. Yep, there's the outside. That's what it looks like from the outside of the chapel. Visitor center is a stone's throw away. You pass the entrance sign about 10 miles before you get here. You feel like you're kind of well within the boundaries of Grand Teton National Park. So you're the superintendent, does a church structure for one specific denomination that only allows Episcopalian worship services belong inside government land. There's a little caveat of it's not actually on government land. So 1% of Grand Teton National Park, and a lot of national parks are similar, is what we call in-holdings, where the park was created, but little carve-outs were made that are still privately owned land. So if you look at why it's a little different color around the Chapel of the Transfiguration, it is not a part of the national park. It's its own tiny little spot owned by the Episcopal Church. Similarly, the Catholics, a little further up in Grand Teton, they have their own spot with the Chapel of Sacred Heart. It's also owned by the Catholic Church, built in 1937. This is the inside of that church. There is a Catholic church inside a national park that is on land. It's leased by the government and used by the Catholic Church. Anybody have any guess where this is? This is the El Cristo Rey Catholic Church. This is at Grand Canyon National Park. Little less glamorous of a building, but what happens when the government builds it? This is the inside of that Catholic church looks like. So also at the Grand Canyon, there was a little grander idea of sunrise Easter services have been being held in the Grand Canyon for a long time. This picture is from 1950 at one of those services with the Arizona State College Choir singing. And a lot of different religious groups got together, Christian groups got together. Actually, no, religious groups got together and tried to fundraise to build called Shrine of the Ages is the name of it. This location was called Shrine of the Ages, and they were going to build a structure there to do shared worship services. This was the original mock-up of the building they wanted to do. So a lot has almost happened in the Grand Canyon. This is one of the things that almost happened. It was almost dammed up. You can actually go see where concrete pillars were placed to dam the Grand Canyon. Didn't happen. Sierra Club got in the way. Sierra Club came out against this as well, not because of any First Amendment issues. They just thought this was ugly and looked like a UFO. So, but the religious groups that came together to do the fundraising for this couldn't get enough money together. They had grand ideas about the building. One of the ideas is they were trying to share it between the Catholic Church, the Protestants, and the Jewish. And so to transition, I mean, we're transitioning between our two services now. They'd have to transition a lot between their services. So part of this building was actually going to be 3 different altars on a hydraulic lift that between services would raise up to the sanctuary level. So this never came to be. They couldn't get enough money raised to actually make this building happen. The government stepped in and did build a Shrine of the Ages. That is a little less glamorous. This is the Shrine of the Ages of the Grand Canyon National Park now. It's used for various religious services as a shared space. It's not specific to one denomination. It's also used just kind of as a general meeting space. So those are some of the religious structures that are in the parks. Let's talk about religious symbols. Again, indigenous people did it first. There are plenty of religious symbols in the parks. But let's talk about some Christian symbols. And are they appropriate? And legally, do they belong? So what is one of the most dominant Christian symbols on national park land, y'all think? It happens right here on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., where that star is. We have any guesses? What's there? No, Washington Monument's just a little further south. The White House is just above it. That is where the National Christmas Tree is, on public national park land. So how's the government get away with that symbol? That's also kind of a shared space. You have the National Menorah right next door. You have other religious symbols that share that space. We're going to bump back to the Grand Canyon. This is Hermit's Rest on the Grand Canyon. It's a historic structure built in 1914 at kind of the end of the carriage route. It was built as kind of a rest stop for those carriage routes. This is kind of the pathway along the south rim of the Grand Canyon from Grand Canyon Village. You take the bus all the way out to the end. Hermit's Rest is way out there. So 1914, that was built. In 1970s, the Evangelical Sisterhood of Mary from Phoenix came out, and they placed 3 plaques along the south rim of the Grand Canyon. So it's 1970s, really not that long ago. These weren't historic plaques. One of them is right here. So if you go to Hermit's Rest, the Grand Canyon itself is off here to the right, and there's a plaque. So if you're the superintendent, you come in and you find these 3 plaques that have been placed up, what do you do with them? This is Psalm 68:4, stuck on the outside of Hermit's Rest. The ACLU in 2003 requested these plaques get taken down. The government did take them down for 2 weeks. The superintendent and the regional solicitor who does that little area of the country decided not the best look. ACLU might be right. We should take these down. A lot of public uproar happened in 2 weeks, made it up to the national level. Head office in DC said, put them back. So they got put back. They are still there. The ACLU never actually filed a formal lawsuit. They just did a request. If there is a lawsuit, there might be a ruling that kind of makes a definitive answer whether they're legally appropriate or not. This is the 3 locations of those across the South Rim. This is the one at Lookout Studio. So if you keep an eye, you'll see them. A little more specific of an example, one that did make a court case all the way up to the Supreme Court. Say you're the superintendent and you get transferred down to this. It's not a national park, it's a national preserve. It's right next to Death Valley National Park. Anybody have any guesses? It's a tough one. All right, this is, let me get my, Mojave National Preserve down there in California. It used to be Bureau of Land Management land, which is also a federal agency. So this was federal public land. And just after World War I, a group came out and placed a large cross up on top of some rocks to honor World War I dead, bearing in mind not all World War I dead were Christians. National Park Service gets the land in 1994. So they kind of get this giant cross sitting on public land with it. So if you're the superintendent, what do you do? So that superintendent kind of just let it be for a while. And then in 1999, a former park employee got with ACLU and sued the government for violating the First Amendment. So this is the 3 tests. So government has to decide, the courts have to decide whether or not this big cross on public land actually violates the First Amendment. So while the government's deciding that, it takes 11 years to make it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the courts say, cover it up. So it gets plastered with plywood, sitting up there on the mountain. And 2010, the Supreme Court finally makes a ruling, but the government played a little switcheroo. And the ruling doesn't actually wind up being on whether or not the cross is appropriate, so we still don't get an answer. What wound up happening is the government switched a 5-acre inholding, those private held land inside the preserve, with the 1 acre the cross was on. So the 1 acre that was public land the cross is on is now owned by the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and the 5 acres inside the park now becomes government property. So the Supreme Court, the lawsuit got changed, and the Supreme Court wound up having to rule on whether or not that land swap was legal. And this, in a closely decided 5-4, the Supreme Court ruled that that land swap was legal as a way of avoiding this controversy. But in the majority ruling, Anthony Kennedy wrote this. So that kind of gets looked at a fair amount. So it wasn't the ruling itself, but this language is in the ruling. That said, there's that balancing act of National Park Service has to do that mission, at the same time allow people to exercise their First Amendment right and not more. So if you go there now, you can still visit it. This is what that cross looks like. I'll blow through. So that's kind of some of the fun controversy that happens with religion in the parks. But I would be remiss if I didn't give my tips and pointers on having a good time visiting the parks. And there's a disclaimer that Kathleen likes me to give of I hate crowds and I hate people. And if you can find spirituality and religion around just hordes of people, like God bless you. That is not me. I will hike days into the woods not to see a soul. So generally speaking, I find spirituality, and this is one of the Park Service recommendations. I like to make a connection with God by avoiding crowds. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So my disclaimers, I hate crowds. This is me a couple days away from any major road. It's getting harder and harder. Visitation's going up. up and up every year. The parks are getting more and more crowded. We've got the big dip here. Does everybody know what that is? That's COVID. That was a wonderful time to be a park employee because there were no visitors. You got to actually enjoy the parks. So, like I said, you're trying to avoid a tour of America's most crowded parking lots. This is Grand Canyon's one of their major parking lots. The canyon itself is over here to the side. I will say I do occasionally like to be around people, and this is one of those times. I recommend the young families this. But if you go to, this is that parking lot. And one of my favorite things to do is if you are at the Grand Canyon, I highly recommend going out here. And if you sit on one of the little benches there, this is a little bit of a rise. So people don't really see the canyon. They may have like glimpsed it through the car window, but until they park here and they walk up, they don't really see it. And so you can sit right there and listen to people's expressions as they see it for the first time. It's very interesting. I mean, every single person is just awestruck. So this is what that overlook often looks like though. So how do you avoid just being shoulder to shoulder with these people? Well, one thing to bear in mind is there's all these National Park Service sites on top of all the other federal public land that you can go visit. Is don't get hung up just on that national park label. I give you an example of that's a national park. I mean, it's okay. I don't know, but like that's, I could talk days about that, but this is just a national monument run by Bureau of Land Management. So there are a lot of places that are more scenic than some of the national parks. So don't just get hung up on the parks themselves. Even the parks, Arches National Park is wonderful. Going to I think they're at a reservation system through most of the summer. So you're having to make reservations when you go to these places now. If you go in the summertime, even with the reservations, a lot of times that's the entrance station where you have to show your reservation. You can get backed all the way down. So Angel's Landing is a wonderful spot in Yosemite and Zion. It's difficult to get up to. It's also one of my pet peeves because it's one of the many typos in the National Park Service. I don't know what there should be an apostrophe there, but somebody, I don't know how long ago, screwed it up. And now I don't know what they're trying, but this is Angel's Landing. Difficult hike to get up there, but this is what that hike often looks like, even with the permit system. So how to get around this? I like going like Angel's Landing. Anybody know that's going? Get the very first permit you can. You're on the first shuttle bus and you're ahead of all the crowd. With the major national parks in the summertime, especially if you're retired, go before the school year lets out or go right after the school year lets back in. And most of these crowds will have disappeared. So also, yeah, don't get hung up on that national park land, very close to Arches, Bryce Canyon, Zion, all of that. You can find many other places like this where there's not nearly as many people. It's Bureau of Land Management. Here's a U.S. Forest Service spot just outside of Tahoe. Absolutely gorgeous. Like I said, traveling outside at peak times is very useful. This is Old Faithful on a typical summer day. The actual Old Faithful itself is over there. That's the lodge behind it. But if you're not confined to the school year and you want to go in the wintertime, you get to take a snowcat into the lodge, and this is kind of how you get to experience it. So I'd have a lot better time finding kind of some spirituality there. Even if you are stuck in the summertime in the peak you're there, you can just avoid peak times and you can get a lot better experience. This is the middle of the summer, middle of the day. If you go at sunrise or sunset, a lot of times many of the day buses have left and there's a lot less people and it is a lot prettier. This is the Grand Canyon at sunset. Colors are better, crowds are less. Highly recommend, especially if you can spend more than one day somewhere, pick one day and have that be the sunset or the sunrise day, and it will be well worth it. I was at Sequoia National Park. I had the entire General Sherman Grove to myself for about 45 minutes. As the sun came up later in the day, there were probably 400 people down there. Some parks just spend a little more time there. Does anybody? Oh, I cheated. I got it on there. This is Dry Tortugas National Park. It's about 70 miles off the coast of Key West. It is an old federal fortress, similar to Alcatraz. Actually got used as a prison. Does anybody know one of the most famous inmates? He got burned up, but his doctor, Dr. Mudd, his doctor was there, held there for a little bit. But so a lot of times if you go visit Dry Tortugas, you're either taking a float plane out or you're taking a 3.5 hour each way ferry ride. But if you can camp and spend the night out there, there will only be about 20 people on the islands. You get the sunset, place yourself. It's a lot more enjoyable. So like I said, Zion gets crowded, but get there first. Even with a little bit of effort at some of these places, like here is the Narrows at Zion National Park. 90% of the people that visit a national park site don't ever leave the pavement. So you really don't have to go far to get rid of some of these crowds, like a quarter-mile hike, 100-yard hike, just enough to get out of earshot of the parking lot, and 90% of these crowds will get left behind. So this is the beginning of that trail that kind of walks through the creek just a little ways down. It's one of my friends last time we were there. Hardly anybody there. Highly recommend it. So that's it. I hope y'all got a little bit out of that, but I'll say, yes. Yeah, so I do mostly law enforcement because I'm on the Natchez Trace Parkway. It's mostly traffic violations, tickets, arrests, mostly DUI arrests, some drugs, things like that, warrants. But then they'll send us out if there's a national park that has an issue, or I do a lot of wildland fire assignments. Well, I'll go for 2 weeks to a fire and do security assignments there because there'll be millions of dollars of government equipment sitting out. So I get to bounce around a fair amount, but it's here it's mostly just law enforcement up and down that parkway. So if you're on the parkway, come out, visit. We have a few waterfalls. Speed limit's 40 for the first 13 miles. It's 50 miles an hour after that. Then you don't have to worry about me. That's the biggest recommendation, and no cell phones. So it's fun. I will say the biggest question I get is my favorite national park. I've been to 2/3 of the parks and over half of the park units. It depends. I went with Miller, the 7-year-old, to Everglades, had a blast. Like, he loved alligators. It was wonderful. If I'd gone with like college buddies, probably wouldn't have been my favorite. So it kind of depends on the time of year and who I'm with, how many friends I have that work there. Every national park site has something to offer. And if you kind of do it with the right purpose and the right reasoning, you can really get a lot out of it. So Miller, did you like Everglades? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, specifically memorials. There are strict federal laws on allowing memorialization, and we don't allow scattering of ashes. Although I will say, if you don't ask for permission, nobody knows. So that's one thing we've seen a lot. So no, those, and we get a lot of, especially when I worked in San Francisco, weddings. I had to be the bad guy and shut down a lot of weddings because I would show up and they were in one of the main parking overlook areas, hogging the whole thing, throwing rice, taking it up, standing where they weren't supposed to be standing. And I have to give them the bad news of like, you guys didn't get a permit. You're not where you're supposed to be. You can't do that here. So no, the crosses, sometimes we'll be polite. We'll talk, have talked to the family because we're involved in the investigation of the crash. And so sometimes somebody will come out. So we'll call the family and be like, hey, we can leave it up for a couple days, but then we got to like take it down. So no. Mm-hmm. What's that? Oof. No, it'll be the park formerly known as Glacier National Park. No, we've renamed a lot of things. There's like even Denali, the mountain used to be Mount McKinley. We've reverted back to the indigenous name of Denali. There's a lot of renaming, especially when it comes to indigenous culture, to make things more appropriate. Yeah, but pretty soon Glacier is going to lose all of its glaciers. Mm-hmm. Yes, we have Biscayne National Park. Biscayne National Park, about 95% of it is underwater. Mm-hmm. And there's like a lighthouse and a few other above park sites, but we have Biscayne, Biscyane. And then there's other federal public land, like Hawaii has a lot, and Dry Tortuga's a lot of it. We have the islands, but the government also has the water surrounding it. So I'll let y'all get to this, but feel free to grab me if y'all have any other questions. If you're going on any vacations, I'm happy to give you pointers as well. But that's some of kind of the fun religious stuff, some of the churches you can go to and controversies that have happened.
Guys, asked me to close.
Oh, go for it.
So thanks to Owen, and let me just close this in prayer real quick. Gracious, holy, loving God, we remember the words of the psalmist, the Lord is the earth and all that is in it. And so we give thanks for our national parks and for Owen and his colleagues who would steward these lands and continue to keep them for us to visit and to enjoy. Lord, help us to continue the call that you have placed on us since Adam and Eve, to be stewards, to be responsible for these lands, and to enjoy them and their grandeur. We ask all these things in your Son, Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Thanks, Owen.